President-elect Trump has just chosen the first members of his administration.
Rassismus. Ein Name steht für diese Angst. Steve Bannon, der neue Chefberater der אנטישמיות והממסד היהודי פה מתנגד בחריפות למימוש שלו.
The most dangerous political operative in America, and now advisor to the president.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Is this the new normal? The U.S. news media, Donald Trump, and the process of normalization. It's not just Angela Merkel's approval ratings that have fallen over the refugee story, so have the German media's. Some questions for the Swedish prosecutor who finally meets Julian Assange inside the embassy. Starting with, what took you so long? And burst mode.
As I said last night,
the cameras at the White House that got in the way of the story. This past week has seen the introduction of a new buzzword into the coverage of American politics, normalization. It describes the attempt by some voices in the U.S. media to soften criticism of Donald Trump following his election victory. Normalization comes in many shades and occurs for various reasons, foremost among them, access. Whether it's a front row seat in the White House briefing room or being on the right email list when a story is leaked, news outlets need access to be in the know. If that means conducting a softball interview or two, writing a favorable piece here and there, setting aside some unsavory comments about women, Muslims, and Mexicans, that's a price that many a journalist is willing to pay. Given Donald Trump's troublesome relationship with the mainstream media, he spent the last part of his campaign demonizing them. Many reporters within the D.C. Beltway are already wondering if they'll ever get the kind of access to the Trump White House that they've had under previous administrations. One of the president-elect's first hires was a far-right media operative, Steve Bannon, and he's no mere press secretary. He's Trump's new chief strategist. Bannon made his name running Breitbart News, a far-right news site which is popular with the kind of voters that the U.S. mainstream media have been accused of overlooking. This appointment says a lot about how Trump's administration will deal with the mainstream media and where this story is going. Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C.
I find the press to be extremely dishonest.
by the way, I hate some of these people.
A big part of the rigging are these dishonest people in the media.
Donald Trump spent a lot of campaign time attacking the mainstream news media.
Don't ask me questions like that. You're not a very good reporter doing that.
And the U.S. media don't get any more mainstream than 60 Minutes,
In Mr. Trump's first television interview as
a CBS institution for almost half a century. And his first post-election interview was different in look, tone, and content. In short, it was all quite normal.
The 60 Minutes interview, I think, was fascinating as a media moment in the way in which everything was framed. He looked more statesman-like. The tone of the interview was very interesting. The interviewer, Leslie Stahl, fell somewhere between deferring to the president-elect.
I don't want to be just a little nice monotone character, and in many cases I will be, sure I can.
And being obsequious. There was a little bit of prodding about the protests.
they're in every city.
But, for instance, there was no talk of the tape in which he talked about groping women, essentially sexual assault.
I saw parts of that 60 Minutes interview. I did not watch the whole thing because it reminded me too much of what I've seen in other countries where a leader is normalized.
I think the press tries to make you into something a little bit different. In my case, a little bit of a wild man. I'm not. I'm actually not. I'm a very sober person.
I studied authoritarian regimes for most of my career. And what you are seeing right now is the normalization of an authoritarian leader. You're seeing a compliant media, you're seeing a complicit media, and you're seeing a media that seems very afraid.
And I think that's the reason why they picked 60 Minutes, knowing that Mr. Trump would not be challenged very forcefully, where he could appear presidential, where he'd be portrayed with respect, to try to have the audience buy into that type of setting as well.
Whether it takes place on the air, in a newspaper, or in a celebrity magazine, normalization is a trend that has not escaped the attention of other voices in the U.S. media. Opinions on the matter in major newspapers range from the determined to the conflicted.
Settle down, guys.
Amongst the considerations at play for news organizations positioning themselves for the new administration is the age-old question of access, the fear of being frozen out by the Trump White House, and starved of news content.
Some of what you're seeing is a traditional respect for the office of the presidency, but what I would urge other journalists to think about is that access isn't actually that difficult to get. There's going to be so much leaking coming out of this White House. Whenever you have a civil war within an institution, that is a bonanza for journalists because everybody wants to talk.
On the flip side, we've seen in Donald Trump an overt willingness to blacklist reporters and media organizations whose coverage that he wasn't terribly happy with. Some journalists have a fear that if they don't have access, they can't do their job as well.
But then you have to say to yourself, what do you do with access, in a state that doesn't want you to tell the truth? What does it mean to have access? And I think that if reporters have access, it will be to do the sort of puff pieces that we've already seen in People and in 60 Minutes, the ones that are trying to assure Americans that everything is normal.
The normalization narrative has crept in despite unprecedented criticism of an American president-elect, much of which is still coming from within Republican ranks.
And the hope, they said in the 1960s,
Glenn Beck, a former Fox News anchor, used to be the toast of the Tea Party and the far right of the GOP. Even Beck is saying that Trump's choice of Steve Bannon as his chief strategist is beyond the pale.
If you know Steve Bannon's agenda and his vision of America, it's not pretty.
Bannon ran Breitbart News, a platform that's popular with the Republican base, described as alt-right by some, far-right by others. And you don't have to dig deep into the site's archives to find headlines like these on racial and gender issues.
Bannon understands the media game and the new media game probably better than anyone else alive. That's where Bannon's value is going to be. Bannon is a general. He's like the General Patton of media. You want him talking strategy.
Breitbart is a power player on the right. There's no question about it. And the idea that their chairman is now a chief strategist at the White House tells you just how rapidly the media outlet has risen in power. However, we are in completely uncharted territory. There is a white nationalist, a white supremacist who is running strategy for the United States administration.
Ryan Grimm runs the D.C. bureau for the left-of-center Huffington Post, while Mike Cernovich, a self-described American nationalist, is hugely popular among Trump supporters and the alt-right for his political views and media critiques that he posts on the web.
I've gotten the suspicion, based on pictures I've seen of various crowds, that the media wasn't telling the full story.
Steve Bannon
led
And their differing views of Steve Bannon, one's white supremacist being the other's General Patton, typify the increasingly polarized U.S. political landscape and the two media echo chambers, where too many Americans go, mostly online, to have their views reinforced rather than challenged.
We are so divided now. People don't talk to each other, and that includes Democrats and Republicans. Most of what we read isn't really journalism, it's editorializing. A 24, 25-year-old blogger at the Huffington Post or the Washington Post, the blogger at the New York Times, they think they know everything about the world, so they don't talk to anybody. They just editorialize about the way the world is according to them and the way they believe the world should be. What journalists should do now is grit their teeth, do actual journalism, and they should leave their echo chambers and talk to the Americans who voted for Trump.
We have never had a political situation in the U.S. like this, mainly because of the splintering of the media. Even 4 years ago, 8 years ago, when Barack Obama was running, the social media aspect of things had nothing like the power it does now. There are many, many people on both sides who don't actually access or engage with media that is representative of the other point of view.
And that is why I'm talking to you right now, and why I talk to people who maybe don't agree with me and who maybe actually want to make me look bad or cover me critically, because as long as we're talking to each other, then we're not being violent towards one another.
Has anyone in the leadership ever said that? You're either going to stop talking or I'm going to cut your mic off.
I want to be very clear on this. Cut his damn mic.
We need to have uncomfortable conversations. That includes the media.
He's going to come
let's
back
stop.
for you.
Everybody, cut the mic.
On the download now, our viewers weigh in on how the American media are adapting to the prospect of President Trump.
The fact major media outlets are now normalizing the election of Donald Trump is both an error and perhaps our own death knell. If editors at the New York Times or the Washington Post think they can somehow make a Trump presidency into something neutral, then they should resign.
Media looked at the reality of what Trump was saying and thought that the absence of any real plan for economic recovery would overcome these vague statements of "I'll make all your dreams come true." So we understood the base. We didn't understand the strength of the emotional appeal to that base over reason and morality.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week: 6 years after the first sexual assault allegations and 4 years since seeking asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, Julian Assange has finally been able to tell his side of the story to a Swedish prosecutor. This past Monday, Ingrid Isgren, Sweden's deputy chief prosecutor, arrived in London to question Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy over allegations of rape, which he denies. Aided by an Ecuadorian prosecutor, she also sought a DNA sample from Assange. It is not yet clear whether he provided it. Julian Assange's lawyer, Per Samuelsson, said he was barred by Ecuador from attending for reasons which are unclear. WikiLeaks said there were numerous irregularities, including the barring of Assange's lawyer, but said that he felt compelled to participate, even with these problems. The Swedish prosecutor's office later issued a statement from Stockholm saying it is looking at the evidence and will take a view on the continuation of the investigation without revealing any kind of timeline. Julian Assange, who refused to travel to Sweden to be questioned for fear, he says, of being extradited to the U.S., has maintained his innocence throughout and has still never been formally charged. Over the past 4 months, ever since the attempted coup, we've reported on the closure of dozens of media outlets in Turkey, as well as a couple of Kurdish channels based outside the country. This past week, a French court ruled that those Kurdish channels should be put back on the air. Last month, Mednuce, which operates out of Brussels, and Nevraz TV, which is also European-based, were both bounced by their satellite provider, a French company called Eutelsat, at the request of the Turkish broadcasting regulator RTÜK, which said that the two channels were spreading terrorist propaganda and supporting the banned Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK. Now, a commercial court in Paris has ruled that the closures were unlawful, that Mednuce and Nevraz TV must be put back on the satellite, and that for every day that does not happen, Eutelsat must pay the two channels 10,000 euros. Farouk Nojatzadeh, the head of Nevraz TV, said they shut our news channel without evidence. That should not happen in Europe. In the countries we come from, these things happen every day. But in Europe, it was shocking that Eutelsat took such a decision. Two journalists in Myanmar could be facing significant jail time after running afoul of Aung San Suu Kyi's government. On November the 5th, Wei Pyo and Tan Tot Ao ran a story in the Daily 11 newspaper in which they alleged that a convicted drug baron may have exchanged gifts with an official from the government in return for a government contract. The paper did not reveal who the politician was, nor did it have to. The chief minister of Yangon, Pyo Min Tem, did that on his own when he went on to say that the allegations in the story damaged his personal dignity. The government has denied any wrongdoing in the story and charged the two journalists with defamation. If convicted, they could face up to 3 years behind bars. The reporters will remain in jail until their hearing on November 25th, which led the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists to say it's outrageous that journalists should be imprisoned without trial under a democratically elected government that has promised more press freedom. We began this program with a story on the growing mistrust Americans have for the mainstream news media there, and that is not a phenomenon limited to the U.S. Last year, when German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced that the country would take in more than 1 million refugees, headlines welcoming them dominated mainstream and social media. However, since then, Merkel's immigration policy has been criticized much more widely, and the media's coverage of the refugee story has been scrutinized much more critically. On the right, the anti-immigrant Alternative for Germany party has made historic gains, and it did so despite its leader accusing the news media of trying to minimize the party's exposure. The AfD's position is that public debate in Germany is managed by a media elite that uses political correctness against them, a view that resonates with some voters who feel their voices have been ignored. Many Germans see their press corps shifting from journalism journalism to activism. And the question becomes, is it the media's role to counter the populist rhetoric fueling the country's right-wing revival? The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the challenges of reporting on the rise of the right, this time in Germany.
Das Willkommen für die Flüchtlinge. Es war und ist immer noch überwältigend.
Ich bin tatsächlich selbst etwas überwältigt. Also
da haben sich auch sehr emotionale Szenen, und zwar von beiden Seiten abgespielt, weil die Münchner wirklich die Flüchtlinge mit Applaus begrüßt haben.
These are some of the feel-good images that circulated in Germany last year after the government opened the borders and offered more than 1 million people refuge. Even the country's conservative Bild surprised many by publishing pull-out welcome guides in Arabic. 1 year on, public sentiment has changed. The political landscape is shifting. The country has taken a turn to the right. On September the 4th, the anti-immigrant Alternative for Germany party, or AfD, beat Angela Merkel's party to take second place in key state elections, and the German media, dominated by the public broadcasters and left-leaning papers, looked on with concern. Because they say that a key part of the AfD's right-wing populist platform is against the mainstream media itself.
The AfD often claims that media is controlled and doesn't report the truth. If you ask an AfD supporter what the role of the media is, the widely held opinion is that some agent from the government walks in here in the mornings and gives us instruction on what can and can't be reported. Of course, that's not the case. No one turns up here and tells us what to do. And that isn't obvious for many people. The AfD leadership plays on that.
Die AfD-Führung spielt damit.
These new right-wing political movements accuse the mainstream media of not reporting the facts, of taking a rose-tinted view of the truth. They accuse them of bias in favor of the government and that they represent the political left.
Bereits jetzt sorgen die Flüchtlinge dafür, dass die deutsche Wirtschaft wächst. Dieses Jahr zusätzlich 0,3%.
It has to do with dwindling trust, and it gets expressed through that excruciating word, the Lügenpresse, the lying press.
The word Lügenpresse is loaded with historic implications. In the 1930s, it's what the Nazis would say about the media. It's recently made its way back into public discourse after it was revived by supporters of a movement called Pegida, which stands for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Occident. The political party, the AfD, was set up in 2013 and has capitalized on the nationalist backlash against Merkel's refugee policies. It accuses the mainstream media of bias in favor of the government, that they've opted to misrepresent them or not represent them at all.
What AfD is criticizing is not wrong. Of course, a lot of problems have been not discussed in the mainstream media. Nobody wanted to give footage to the right wing. And this is the problem. Truth is truth. And if you decide only one part of the truth is good for the public, you will fail your job.
And the biggest perceived media failing was in the coverage of the sexual assaults that took place last New Year's Eve in Cologne. The story went largely untouched for several days, and when the media did get to it, they were cautious on a significant angle, the suggestion that refugees had been among the attackers. It was a turning point, one in which the media's credibility took a hit.
It was confirmation for many people that these refugees weren't simply people fleeing war, who we should take in. Rather, they are criminals who don't respect our women, don't agree with our German culture. And this was simply proof of all these prejudices and all these stereotypes.
All of the media began reporting 4 days too late, including us. We simply weren't aware of it. We didn't have any reporter there. And many other media outlets didn't either. We actually only received the information at the office very late, when the police began to report what had really happened there, as the police had given very different press releases on New Year's Eve.
The mistrust of the media had already been building, and not just among right-wing neo-nationalists. Even before the attacks in Cologne, the general public was expressing a concern that the media weren't giving them the facts on the refugee story. In a poll conducted last year by the Allensbach Institute, while a majority of Germans said they still trusted the media on most issues, more than 40% described the reporting on refugees as one-sided. And 53% of Germans questioned said they didn't believe the media were being straight about who the refugees are, their level of qualifications, and the number of women and children among them. That shift in how Germans see their media, with the majority of them doubting the journalism produced on the refugee story, has come largely at the expense of the public broadcasting networks, ZDF and ARD, which dominate political coverage. Trying to keep a lid on some of the populist rhetoric fueling the country's right-wing revival does not meet everyone's definition of journalism. But there's some history behind this, in which Germany's public broadcasters played a part.
Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren.
After the Second World War, public service media played a central role in the process of denazification, an Allied initiative to rid German society, including the economy, judiciary and the press, of any remnants of National Socialist ideology. That sense of civic duty seems to have endured, but it's provoked some unease around the refugee story.
The loss of trust can be attributed to the fact that when refugees started coming to Germany last year, the country went through a honeymoon period. We were celebrating our culture of hospitality. But the story moved on, and increasingly, the refugees became targets of criticism.
Media hates complexity. Media likes and loves emotions. So the so-called welcome culture was fantastic for our media. It was romantic, it was idealistic, but it had nothing to do with the complexity of the problem. Nobody asked, what does 1 million people coming into Germany in a short term of time, what does it mean for the needs of integration? Nobody did ask this. And this is the reason why our media failed totally the discussion about migration.
Public broadcasters disagree, and they disagree live, on air, on a regular basis.
Wenn man also nicht der Meinung ist, dass alle Flüchtlinge Schmarotzer sind, die verjagt, verbrannt oder vergast werden sollten, dann sollte man das ganz deutlich kundtun, dagegenhalten.
Because for these journalists, it goes much deeper, back to a haunting story Germany has seen before, one that they don't want to be telling again.
And finally, despite going digital, professional news photographers still like the satisfying sound of that mechanism in their SLRs, their single-lens reflex cameras. And they don't produce it just once, like your camera phone. Set a DSLR camera onto burst mode, and those clicks come at a rate of 12 per second. Now, we're not sure just how many pictures news photographers took of Barack Obama and Donald Trump at their White House meeting last week, but it's got to be in the thousands. And many Americans were equally unsure of what the two men were actually saying to each other over the sound of all those shutters slamming open and shut. Then a lot of people jumped online to complain about that. But we're guessing that when all is said and done with the Trump story in 4 or 8 years' time, that the camera clicks might prove easier on the ear than the sound bites. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
We talked about foreign policy, we talked about domestic policy, and as I said last night, my #1 priority in the coming 2 months is to try to facilitate a transition that ensures our president-elect is successful. We want to do everything we can to help you succeed, because if you succeed, then the country succeeds. Please, sorry.
Well, thank you very much, President Obama. This was a meeting that was going to last for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and we were just going to get to know each other. We had never met each other. I have great respect. The meeting lasted for almost an hour and a half, and it could have, as far as I'm concerned, it could have gone on for a lot longer. I very much look forward to dealing with the president in the future, including counsel. He explained some of the difficulties, some of the high-flying assets, and some of the really great things that have been achieved. So, Mr. President, it was a great honor being with you, and I look forward to being with you many, many more times in the future. Thank you, sir.